is more important than church? Why does it feel like everything is more important than church? Getting your kids to all these other activities is more important than church. That's what we're going to try to explore today. So to do that, let me start by telling you two stories. So right before the pandemic, I was at a youth ministry conference, and a young woman came up to me after my presentation and said, could we have coffee at some time before the conference is over? She said, I am a senior in college. I'm at a college where I am preparing for ministry. I'm a youth ministry major at my college, and I would love to talk. I just figured she wanted to talk about going to seminary. So I said, sure. We set an appointment. We got our cups of coffee. We were talking, and I launched into why she should go to seminary, why seminary is a good idea, why particularly if you're going to be in youth ministry, you should go to seminary. I even humbly said why Luther Seminary would be a good seminary to go to, thinking I am going to recruit a student for our seminary. And she was so nice. She just stood there with her cup of coffee and listened to my whole pitch. And then she said, thank you. That's not why I wanted to talk to you. She said, the reason I wanted to talk to you is because this last semester, as part of my program, I did a 10-hour-a-week internship. It was called a practicum, and so I worked 10 hours in a congregational youth ministry. And she said it was my job to plan a bunch of the events and get all that stuff going. And she said, you know, what we would do is we would plan all these things. Parents and young people would say they would be there, and then it would come the day of, and we'd get a bunch of calls that said, oh, we're too busy, we can't come. And she said, you know, I just don't know. It started to get really frustrating. And we'd plan all these things, and then nobody would show up to this stuff. And she said, I'm not mad at anyone. I mean, I'm not morally outraged by that. When I was in high school, she said, gymnastics was the most important thing in my life. And basically from October till April, I was gone from my church at gymnastics. But I'm not so sure then I want to do youth ministry with my life. I'm trying to decide, should I do youth ministry or should I just be a coach? Because it just feels like sports and other activities is a thing that parents and young people are more into than church. Church just isn't a thing that holds as much weight. And I was really taken back by this use of the word a thing. It wasn't a thing they're really into. They're into all sorts of other things. So I decided, as a pinheaded academic, to start interviewing some parents around the Twin Cities area and kind of get a sense of how church is important to them, how it isn't important to them, what they think of their youth ministries. So I interviewed a bunch of Protestants across the continuum, from very conservative Protestants to very progressive Protestants, and they all use this word, a thing. It's really important for our kid to find her thing, that he finds his thing. The thing, the thing, the thing. Well, I was telling a friend about this, and he said, you know, you should interview some people who don't go to church. See what they do. You've been interviewing all people who are part of a church in one way or another. Interview some people who don't go to church. He said, I'm part of the basketball association in our community. There's some great parents in the basketball association. So I made an appointment with this couple, went to their house. They nicely invited me in. They had 3 daughters, ranging from 12 to 16. I went into their house. It was an incredibly warm, welcoming place, but also looked a bit like it was in process. There were stacks of laundry everywhere. You could tell mail hadn't been looked at for days. We sat down, and these 2 parents explained that basketball is pretty much their life. Dad coaches 2 of the girls' basketball teams. Mom coaches 1. Their whole lives, they said, particularly in the winter months, but even beyond that, is just basketball, basketball, basketball. We are in a gym at least have 2 practices a night, and on the weekends, these parents said, easily 5 games on a Saturday or Sunday. The dad said, all we really do is basketball, laundry, repeat. Basketball, laundry, repeat. And I was just taken aback by admiration, because this is an incredible commitment. And, you know, I was thinking, how do you watch 4 hours of TV a night and go to all of these practices? You see my priorities. But I think Mom misinterpreted my admiration, because I was just a bit, you know, wide-eyed by this. And she said, I know, we seem basketball crazy, but we're really not that basketball crazy. And she said, for instance, after the last basketball season, our middle daughter came to me and said, I don't want to play lacrosse this year. So all the girls' second sport was lacrosse. And she said, Mom, I don't want to play lacrosse. And mom said, she's telling me this story, she said, I said to my daughter, that's fine. You don't have to play lacrosse, but then what would you like to do instead? What would you like to do instead of play lacrosse? And mom reports to me that the middle girl says, well, I don't want to do anything. I would like to not do anything. And then mom says that she said to the daughter, no, not in this family. In this family, you will do something. I don't care if it's a craft class at the local community college. I don't care if it's picking up a musical instrument. I don't care what it is, but you're going to have to do something. And then she used the same words the youth ministry major did. She said, it's so important to us that our daughters find their thing. If they don't find their thing, I really worry about it. So what is this sense of a thing? I mean, you already get a sense of it. It's an activity that usually young people like, maybe have some passion around. It usually takes some time and some investment. It's supposed to bring some value to a child's life. But I think it actually does a bit more here. I think it does significant work finding this thing, whether it's a sport, whether it's a musical instrument, whether it's learning how to design websites and code, that it does certain really important work, I think, particularly for middle class and upwardly mobile parents. I think particularly it becomes a structure that young people hang their identity on and also hang the sense of the good life on. So I'm going to take these one at a time and show you how these work. So let's start with identity. Now when I say identity, it is very true that we live in an identity age. I mean, one of the biggest questions that seems to be out there and seems to be negotiated around social media and things like that is trying to figure out identity questions. But what I mean by identity ultimately at its most base is that identity is trying to answer this question, who am I? Who am I? So I think in our time, we tend to assume that answering this question, who am I, is mainly an internal construction. It mainly happens inside the head of a young person. So an 11-year-old or 12-year-old goes to her room. Maybe she watches 8 or 10 YouTube videos, but at some point she comes out of her room and she makes a declaration. She says, this is me. This is my identity. Now we're at a time, I think, broadly, culturally, where the response to that assertion, this is me, for the most part needs to be affirmation and acceptance. That what a parent does, what a grandparent does, what a teacher does, is accept the identity proclamation of the young person. Now you can all think there were times when maybe it wouldn't work that way. But that tends to be how we function now. Now, I'm just going to give you a slice of why this is the case. We could talk for 2 hours on why this is the case. But of those of you who were with us yesterday afternoon, we talked about Charles Taylor. And one thing Charles Taylor says forms our time is that we live in a time of authenticity. He even calls this an age of authenticity, where we tend to always feel like it is a good thing to be authentic. I mean, if someone said to you, look at you, you are a really authentic person, you would take that as a compliment. You'd be like, thank you. Thank you very much, I am. Or you went to a coffee shop in town and they're like, this coffee shop, this is such an authentic coffee shop. You'd be like, this, thank you very much. Our church, we are a very authentic church. It's always a good. And that's not always been the case. In some places, in some smaller communities, and some other places in the world, being authentic is not a high good. But for us, it is a high good. And this living in an age of authenticity also creates what Charles Taylor calls an ethic of authenticity. There's an ethic to it. And you all know this ethic very well. The ethic of authenticity says this. It says every human being has a right to define for themselves what it means for them to be human. And no other human being should ever tell a human being what it means for that human being to be human. That you get to discover your own unique authenticity. Now we are at a time where it feels like this becomes, well, there's excesses to it, I think. And we could talk all day about that. And we could talk about if this is good or this is bad. But it's here. And there are some good elements to it. Some people who before couldn't express their experience now are free to express their experience. People who weren't heard before now can be heard before they can speak of their authentic experience. But what I want you to see for us today is, man, living inside of an age of authenticity can be very difficult if you're a parent. So at a major point, you just need to accept how your child or your grandchild asserts their identity. And if you don't, you violate the ethic of authenticity. If you try to put your hands on your kid's identity too much, it tends to be ruled out as bad parenting or just even bad way of acting. So one of the ways the thing becomes very significant is if a parent, you don't, and again, I don't know that anyone knows this directly, but it's in the kind of tacit back of our minds. If you can't really put your hands on your kid's identity and form it in a certain way, and it could be a violation of being a bad parent if your kid said, "This is me," and you said, "No, it isn't. No, that's not you." Well, what you can do, if you can't directly oppose that, and it's even hard to pass on values and things like that, one of the things you could do is get your kid involved in all sorts of things. I don't know what happened to my slides here. Oh, my slides went away. Oh no. I'm not sure. Is it the screen?
Unplug it, plug it back.
Okay, let's see if it works.
Is your laptop still?
Yeah, my laptop's up and going.
What's the TV now?
Oh, there it is. It's coming back to life. There, it's back to life. Oof. Oof. You know, me and TV, I'm going to give it up. All right. But the point being, yes, I did talk in the sermon about the problem of technology, and now you see me sweating, needing the technology. It's getting back at me if we're talking about that. But you can see one of the things you can do as a parent, if you can't really direct their identity, is you can get your kid involved in a bunch of things. And the hope is, and as I talked to these parents, it was really clear when they said, it's really important for our daughter to find her thing. The idea was, well, if she gets really into soccer, then I can be a part of that, and soccer will press into the soft play of her identity and start to formulate and help her answer the question, who am I? So you can't maybe directly pass on the way she should understand herself, but even starting at 6, 7, 8, you can help your child find the different interests, the different activities that could really become their thing. Like, I'm a soccer player, I'm a violin player. It will help them with their identities. Now, to get a sense of how I think complicated this is, and maybe how we can feel of this, we can think of it like this. Well, I mean, one interesting icebreaker if we had all day today would be to have you turn to someone at your table and tell them the strangest thing you did during the early months of COVID. Like, remember how strange those days were? Remember when we were wiping down our mail? Remember that? Like, a box of cereal would come into your house and you were spraying it down and wiping it down. It was very weird times. We had a middle schooler and an early high schooler at the time, and it was, I mean, I think it was hell for everyone, but it was hell for us. And we have neighbors who are right next door whose kids are of the same age, and we didn't even know if like these kids could look at each other, you know, and these kids were together all the time. So after like 5 weeks, we're like, we gotta do something. So we decided what we were gonna do is have movie nights. But what I would do is I took the shower curtain off of my shower and hung it on my deck. And I got a projector, and we got a Bluetooth speaker, and they sat in their yard, and we sat in our yard, and we watched movies. But we're Gen X parents, so we're like, we need a theme to this movie. So we decided to show our kids John Hughes movies. That's what we're going to do. Some of you know John Hughes movies, these 1980 high school movies. So the first movie we showed them was Ferris Bueller's Day Off. Yeah. I mean, this is my official review that you can take away. This doesn't mean anything for this presentation, but this will be good information for you. The Andy Root review of Ferris Bueller's Day Off, it holds up, people. That is a good movie. I really enjoyed rewatching it. Second week, we watched Pretty in Pink. I loved Pretty in Pink when I was in high school. It changed my life. People, it's garbage. It doesn't make any sense. The acting is terrible. The plot doesn't. You're like, what is this? So we watched those two, but then we got to the epic John Hughes high school movie of all John Hughes high school movies. You know what I'm talking about? Breakfast Club. Breakfast Club, the ultimate movie of all movies. And if you were raised in a high school kid in the 80s or early 90s, Breakfast Club was something. And one of the reasons it was is because it was really a thought experiment. John Hughes was playing with the idea of what if you took every possible identity you could be in late 1980s suburban American life, and you put them in detention together for an afternoon. So there were like 4, 5, 8, 10 different identities you could be. So in that movie, you get the jock, and you get the homecoming queen, and you get the wrestler kid who's got a bad family life, and you get the girl who's really pretty but is really weird, and you get the computer kid. You had every identity you could be in 1985 there. And we did assume back in the 80s or 90s that maybe, depending on the community, there were 10 or 15 or 20 different identities you could be. And that's one reason why your gym teacher never really stood up and made sure you didn't get picked on. You know, they're like, bullying was everywhere in the 1980s. And you have to hear me correctly, this wasn't good. This is a terribly painful thing. But for the most part, there was an assumption that bullying had a positive good to it. And the positive good was that if you were acting too weird outside the 8 or 10 or 15 identity options, you got bullied onto one. That's why your gym teacher said, don't pick on him. Okay, don't. And then just didn't pay attention anymore. There was a kind of assumption that you could get bullied on to one of the identity options. The school that my kids have gone to high school in, there is zero tolerance bullying. If you bully, you get kicked out of school immediately. There is no patience for it whatsoever. And part of the reason is the shifting in how we think identity moves. We don't think there are 4 or 10 or 15 identity options anymore. We think that there are an exponential amount of identity options, that every individual can construct their own identity. Again, we could have a long debate, is this good or is this bad? But one thing it does become is a lot of pressure for a parent, that you just have to somehow negotiate this, not put your hands too hard on the way your kid defines it. But one of the things you could do, again, is get your kid involved in a sport, and that might help them understand who they are. Get them involved with a musical instrument. Help them learn Spanish. All those things may be able to help them answer the question, who am I? Now, in New Canaan or in around Connecticut, do you have played against sports? Have you heard of played against sports, or is this just a Midwestern thing? So in the Midwest, there's a thing called played against sports. Some of you know what played against sports is. It's a sporting goods store, but what they do is sell new sporting goods equipment, but they also sell used sporting goods equipment, and you get majorly ripped off. If you sell your used sporting good equipment, they give you, if you are lucky, 10 cents on the dollar. So you just paid $200 for a baseball bat and you sell it a year later to Play It Against Sports, they act like they're doing you a favor, giving you $20 back for this. But everyone complains in the Midwest, but does it. And there are 13 of these stores in the Twin Cities. But everyone does it because they're not just buying your stuff, they're doing you a service. Once a year, you get to back your car into your garage, open up your trunk, and throw in all the artifacts of the failed things that are there. Which this is part of the issue, is all those things, you got to try them a lot out. You got to try skiing, you got to try golf, you got to try soccer, you got to try this kind of dance, you got to try this musical instrument and that musical instrument, and most of them fail. They will not become significant enough to really help a kid for it to become their thing. So you're going to have a lot of stuff in your garage that was only used 2 times. So what you get to do is back your car into the driveway, open the trunk, throw the golf clubs in there, throw the skis that were used 2 times, throw the baseball pitch back that was begged to have, and then you get to drive to Play It Against Sports and get 10 cents on the dollar. They're doing you a favor. But it shows you have to give a lot of options here if you're a parent, and only maybe 1 or 2 will really stick. If you need a social scientific research on this, there's a great book by Annette Lauro called Unequal Childhoods. And she looks at the difference between working class parents and middle class parents. And when she talks about the parenting style of middle class parents, she calls it concerted cultivation. That parents take a concerted effort to cultivate something for their kid. That they feel like it's really important that they can use concerted effort to cultivate their thing. Now, that's identity. But there's also a deep sense that this hangs the good life on this. That it's not just getting your kid to find their thing, helps them understand who am I, will help them answer who am I. I'm a soccer player, I'm a violin player, I'm connected to this team, but it will also frame for them the good life, what it means to live a good life. Now we are strange creatures, us human beings, because we are the strange kind of creatures, the strange animals, who really want to live a good life. Now, I don't want to disparage dolphins, so I don't know what dolphins are talking about in the ocean. There's always someone in a room, they're like, but whales, they might, but I don't think there's any whales university. But maybe there is at the bottom of the ocean. But we, I think, are the only kind of creatures who really, really care about living a good life in the sense that we think about it all the time. That we're always thinking, am I living a good life? That you could live half your life, wake up, and be overtaken by existential terror that you missed it. That you spent your first half of your life living a kind of life that wasn't good. We call this a midlife crisis. Or we think whole societies, whole civilizations could live with a warped sense of the good life. We really want to live a good life. And you can find it, I mean, we don't think this with our animals, with our dogs. For instance, Max the beagle. You know, like if Max dies, no one sits around and goes, oh, Max, I mean, we're going to miss you, Max. But poor Max, I mean, he missed it. He just didn't live a good life. It's so sad. I mean, he just spent his whole life lying in a sunbeam and not doing anything. And poor Max, I mean, the guy lived for chasing squirrels. He never caught one. He was 0 for 150,000 chases. I just feel so bad. I mean, let's remember Max well, but he failed. He lived a bad beagle life. You know, no, we don't do that with our dogs. We don't think they're laying around going, what does it mean to live a good life? But we do think that with human beings, and it filters even into our language. So for instance, in my neighborhood in St. Paul, where the salt of the earth people live, not like those snooty Minneapolis people, there's a little corner store called Speedy Market, and if you really live in my neighborhood, like truly live there, you're there 3 days a week, picking up an avocado or something. And before our son went to college, I got all of our milk there. So I would go in once a week and get a lot of milk, like, 6 cartons. And I would always be thrust into a deep moral face-off when I would get that milk. Because I would go, I would put the cartons up on the counter, and the university student who was checking me out from the University of Minnesota would ask me a deep, deep moral question. He would say, paper or plastic? And this happened to me a half dozen times, and it felt out of body, like I was watching myself say it, because it was so embarrassing. I found myself saying, plastic, because I pick up my dog's poop with it. As if this college kid cares that I have a dog that poops a lot. But I felt compelled to add that editorial note because I want him to know that I know people who are living a good life don't just use one-time plastics, that there's an ecological problem with this. So I want you to know that I reuse them. I pick up my dog's poop with them. But what happens, of course, is this university student doesn't really respond to my confession and just listening to some podcast or something. So then I do the moral karate on him, and I think, oh, is this one of these young adults who cares more about streaming video games than the ecological crisis we're going through? We're always kind of negotiating these moral senses of what it means to live a good life. But as I walk out the door with my milk in plastic bags, my neighbor comes and opens the door for me, and my neighbor asks me a deeply, deeply moral question. My neighbor says, hey, your kids, they good? Your kids good? Ooh, that's a deeply moral question. Are my kids aimed towards the good? Are they aimed towards a good life? What do? My response is to rattle off all the things they're involved in. Yeah, they're doing good. Maisie's running cross country. Her time's getting better. It's great. I think the team's going to do really well this year. Owen's playing piano. He's advancing in it. It's really great. Yeah, things are going well. I relay all of our activities. And then, of course, I say, we're busy, but it's good. Yeah, we're good. We're busy, but we're good. There could be a completely different moral imagination. I could say when my neighbor says, hey, your kid's good, I could say, especially as a theologian with a wife who's a pastor, we could say, well, Maisie's doing okay. She's in the midst of penance for sin. So she's wearing our family hair shirt to gym class. It's tough, but this is how penance works. Because Owen was in the woods, and he saw a vision. We're not sure if it was demonic or it was holy yet, but we're trying to discern what this vision meant. If I said that to my neighbor, social services would be at my door in hours. My neighbor would think my children are being blocked from living a good life. So you see how this moral imagination frames us. So imagine that question, are the kids good? Let's imagine we ask that to the church. Are the kids good? As a large framework. I actually make a assertion that I think our forms of doing youth ministry are how we answer this question, are the kids good? Like the shape it takes. So if you were to ask this, are the kids good? At the end of the 18th century in London, say, are the kids good? The response you would have gotten was, we're a bit worried. The British Empire is advancing, industrialization has come to London and around England here, and we have a lot of young people working in these factories, but they can't read or write. And we don't know if the church is in a good place, and if the empire is in a good place, if these kids can't read or write. So a guy named Robert Reichs creates this thing that we still have across Protestantism, across the church, creates something called the Sunday School. You go to the end of the 19th century, early 20th century in America, and you ask, are the kids good? The response you would have gotten were probably twofold, especially around this part of the country, around New England particularly. You would have gotten, we're worried. We're not so sure they're as committed as their parents were. We're not so sure that they're taking their journey with God seriously enough. So you get this thing created called Christian Endeavor, where kids gather and talk about, have to relay their advancement in the faith. Or you would have heard, big move towards urbanization right now. A lot of young people are leaving farms, moving into urban areas. We're not so sure that is good for our young people. And then what do? You get the creation of something else we've had, the YMCA. So now if you ask this question after World War II, into the 60s and the 70s, into a kind of post-war move into suburbs and a suburban, growing middle class in America, if you would ask, are the kids good? The response you would have gotten was, we're not sure. We're afraid they're growing up too quickly. They don't have really much to do in these suburbs, and then they gather in parking lots, or they just have parties, and they just seem to be wanting to grow up too fast. We're worried about that. So what we want to do is we want to start, instead of having them gather in some parking lot somewhere and drink beer or just hang out in someone's basement and do drugs, what we're trying to do is have them come to church and bring that social gathering to the church basement, and we're going to call it a youth group. And they're going to come and hang out in the church basement, and basically the person who's going to lead that is going to be just a few years older than them, because the point is just to gather and slow down. Don't worry about sex, drugs, and rock and roll can be Christian rock and roll. Don't worry about growing up so fast. Let's come hang out. And that's why we're going to do incredibly sophisticated things in this church basement. We're going to see how many marshmallows we can get in our mouth at one time. And then we're going to take a gutter and we're going to put ice cream in it, and we're going to have an ice cream eating contest. This is what we're going to do every week. And so you ended up with these huge youth groups because kids really, especially in suburban areas, didn't have much else to do other than their sport or whatever. They could just really come and hang out. To give you a pop culture link to this, Stranger Things. Does anyone watch Stranger Things on Netflix? If you are a Gen Xer, this is like nostalgia on top of nostalgia, because the show is based in 1983 in a suburb in Indiana, but it's also shot just like a Spielberg movie, so it feels like the movies you grew up on, and then it's about the period. But what's fascinating about the show, if you know the show, it's like a bunch of middle schoolers, a 1980s movie, who an evil organization or corporation in town opens up a wormhole underneath, and one of their friends gets sucked in, and monsters come out, and these kids have to save Hawkins from being overtaken by these monsters. The show has to be a period piece. It has to be based in 1983. If it was based in 2015, it wouldn't work. It couldn't work. Mikey, one of the kids, would have no time to fight demigorgs in a junkyard because he'd have traveling baseball. He couldn't be there. It'd be like, hey, we need to fight these demigorgs. Like, I can't. I gotta go see I got a tutor I gotta see, and then I'm doing Spanish lessons, and then we have 4 baseball games on the weekend, so I really can't do it. Or his mom would be following him on his phone and be like, Mikey, why are you in a junkyard? We do not have time to take you to get a tetanus shot, get home right now. It has to be based in 1983. One of the funnier pieces about this is that Mrs. Wheeler, so this is Mikey's mom, and you see her in season 1, and this was going all around social media, and people were laughing because she seems utterly oblivious. I mean, the whole driving engine of the plot of the show is there's a paranormal child living in the basement that she doesn't know about. And all she does is provide a hot meal, dad falls asleep on a recliner, she has no idea where her kids are. And remember, this was true, those of us who grew up in the 80s. There used to be a PSA that would come on at 10:30 after the news that would say, beep, beep, beep. Do you know where your children are? Because they didn't know. They didn't know. We were out doing whatever. And this isn't bad parenting. I mean, now from our perspective, we look back and think, what terrible parents. Mrs. Wheeler is a terrible parent. She doesn't know anything about her kids. But in 1983, she was a good parent. This was good parenting practice. You provided your kids a safe neighborhood with a basement that they could play Dungeons and Dragons in or whatever, and then you just got out of the way and said, be home by 11 or be home by 10:30, and there was all this free space. And what kids did with that free space was grow up really quickly, get really obsessed with sex and drugs and things like that. And the church came in to say, why don't we just gather and have youth group? You got big youth groups, 70, 80 kids in a youth group, but these really were fast times. And in this growing up fast times, you could do that. Those times don't really exist anymore. We've had a huge shift in parenting practice. And the flip has been from a very permissive parenting style. Mrs. Wheeler, very permissive. Just be home by 10:30, be home for dinner, just do whatever you want. Please don't have the police come to the house. That's all, everything else is fine. We've had a flip. And now parenting style is not permissive. It's very much a very organized, attentive. We know, and I'm saying this about myself, as anyone else in this room, we know where our kids are at all times. Now, they could be up in their room in some digital space that we don't understand, but we know that they are up in their room. So it's flipped to a parenting style where it's very much oversight and very much kind of firm, but not quite authoritarian, because one of the interesting dynamics is that we switched from Mrs. Wheeler to, well, let me say this, that it becomes really parenting around a list of things that your kid is involved in. So you have homework, and you have test prep, and you have volleyball, and you have debate club, and you have piano. So you have to organize all these things, where in 1983, you maybe played baseball, you maybe had to think about your tests, or else you just kind of hung around the neighborhood. Now you have piano, you have work, you have soccer, you have cleaning your room, you have driver's ed, you have Netflix and relaxing. I actually have to tell you all, it's very rare in your life where you can pinpoint the moment where you're old. But this happened to me with this slide. Because this used to say, cleaning your room, driver's ed, and Netflix and chill. And then sleep. And I went on and I was lecturing to a bunch of young youth workers. And then one of them came up at the break and said, yeah, Professor Root, are you aware that Netflix and chill is a euphemism for casual sex? And I said, no, I had no idea. And that's the moment. That's when I realized I was old. So, not Netflix and chill, excuse me. But Netflix and relax, all right? Sorry. I'm having that correct. So, you need to organize all of these things. And so then there's youth group. So you need a parent who can help you organize all of these things, where in the 1980s, maybe you only had 3 or 4. Now your parent's job is to help you manage all of this different stuff that you're part of. So it changes from a very permissive parenting style to a very organized one, a very involved one. But the involved isn't authoritarian, and it can actually be quite warm if your mom or your dad is not organizer, scheduler, prison guard, but is your best friend. So we get a switch from Stranger Things to the Gilmore Girls, where Lorelai and Rory are their best of friends. Now, I don't know if this is true in your house, but in my house, this dumb show is on all, it's only dumb. I'm sorry if I offended you. This is your favorite show. It's just on constantly in my house. It's just streamed constantly. And the interesting thing is that they're best friends. They're really best friends. And that's beautiful. I mean, we should not disparage that if you did ask my daughter who her best friend is, she would say, my mom is my best friend. It's beautiful. We should not disparage it. A lot of young people I know would say that about their parents. I just gotta say though, when I was in high school, if someone asked me who my best friend was and I said, my mom is my best friend, I would still be in a locker. I would be shoved so deep in a locker, I'd still be trying to get out of the locker. But in some sense, you need your mom to be your best friend because your mom is organizing your whole schedule of all the activities of these things and driving you around and making sure you get from this to that. So it leads to this sense of a very different dynamic of what it means to grow up. So this is Jean Twenge has this book called iGen, which is the word she wants to use for Generation Z. And she says this really interesting quote. She says, contrary to the prevalent idea that children are growing up faster than previous generations did, iGen, this is what she means, Generation Z, are growing up much more slowly. 18-year-olds are now acting like 15-year-olds used to, 13-year-olds like 10-year-olds. Teens are physically safer than ever, yet they are more mentally vulnerable. Which is a really interesting dynamic. A friend who does campus ministry at an elite university, small liberal arts elite university, says now 1/3 of the freshman class comes in without their driver's license. When I was 16, the first thing you did the minute after you turned 16 was go get your driver's license. My daughter, 17, she'll get a driver's license in the next 2 weeks. She's not in a rush. She's got all these other things, too busy to do it. We know things like first kiss, first sexual experience, all that stuff is happening way later than it used to. So because the whole society is going faster, growing up, unlike the 1980s or 90s, is slowing down. Kids are growing up much more slowly. They're spending much more time with their parents. So she bases a lot of this research in San Diego, and she says, if you look a couple generations ago in San Diego, like in the 80s and the 90s, you would go to a mall, there were kids everywhere. You go to a mall now, she says, there are kids everywhere. Big difference. In the 80s, there were no parents around. They were all by themselves. Now I go, and they're all with their parents. A lot of time spent with their parents. That's good. But it also connects to this kind of further flip, which is at some point, all of these things need to be ranked. So you want them all. But at some point, because you're a finite human being, and you only have so much time, and the Google Calendar is going to conflict, you have to decide which ones are the most important. And I think one of the things that is true for most parents is they would like their kids to be involved in church. They would like them to go to youth group. But when it conflicts with volleyball tryouts, it's very hard to think, oh, I need my kid to go to Wednesday night youth group instead of going to volleyball tryouts. So again, no one has this, well, I would say no one has this on their refrigerator, ranked like this, but it ends up happening in one way or another. So maybe youth group is ranked when there's conflicts in schedule, just above walking the dog and organizing the sock drawer. But it's just very hard, I think, and again, this is more unthought than directly thought, to think, oh, my kid, the priority of the conflict, it's more important for my child to be at a youth group than to prepare for ACT or SAT, or just to have homework done, or maybe even just to get a good night's sleep. So at some point, these things have to be ranked. Now let me be a bit dire here, but I think this is very important to say. I think it is really, really hard for any congregation to move youth group up the rank. I think it is a very hard thing. And yet most churches, that's exactly what they want. They hire their youth director or their youth pastor, and they hired her because they want her to take this from 12 and move it up, well, maybe not even to the top 3, but move it up into 6 or 7. That becomes your job. And we can get very annoyed. And people say all the time, like, well, you know, this church, we used to have 35 kids at youth group. Now we have 15. What's wrong here? Well, what has changed is not the passion, the intention for ministry. What's changed is the whole cultural context. And when you could have big youth groups when kids didn't really have anything to do. They're just going to be hanging out. I mean, you used to go in just maybe not New Canaan, but a lot of other communities around the country, there was a spot where high school kids just hung out. They just hung out and did nothing. And it sometimes would be in a church parking lot, and then you'd have these big conversations in session, like, can we have kids hanging out in the parking lot? They're leaving Mountain Dew cans everywhere, and there are cigarette butts, and then they start skateboarding on the steps. So can we cover that in our insurance? These used to be big questions in the mid-'90s. Now, you go around America, it's hard to find. Maybe you can find somewhere in the South in a small town, but it is rare to find an area where all kids are hanging out in the back of a pickup truck or where they park and they're just hanging out, doing stuff. They don't have time. They have all this other stuff that they have to negotiate and they have to figure out. So to get the youth group up is very, very hard. Sometimes I talk to young youth workers and they'll say things that stereotypically usually is a young male guy who will say, you know, in our community, swimming is really important, varsity swimming. And if kids will get in the pool at 5 in the morning to make varsity, then what we want is a kind of youth ministry where kids will come to church and read their Bibles at 5 in the morning. And I always look at them and want to hug them and say, you're so cute. That is so cute. But here's a helmet because you're going to concuss yourself banging your head against the wall. Because again, the structure, and this is what's really important here, the structure of the good life doesn't allow that to occur. So why this gets ranked this way is because parents have a perception of what is good for their kid. And unfortunately, all these things seem, if we can talk like a 4-year-old, gooder than youth group. Now what's hard is that youth group or even church involvement isn't off, for a lot of people, it isn't off the list. So they still do think it's good. It's still good if we can fit it in the schedule. If we can't fit it in the schedule, then it gets pushed down. And we'd almost be in a bit of a better place if they thought, no, being part of a church is bad for our kid. And then at least we could talk about the gospel, its significance, its claims it makes on our life, the way it transforms us. But for most middle class folks, it's still good. It'd be great. Your kid will have a kind of religious sensibility. There's good friends there that they could make. It's value added. But when it comes to helping your kid live a good life, really being involved in these things holds a lot more weight off it. And so this does have a ton to do with the shape of the good life. And this is, I think, just true for us Americans, that the way the good life is shaped for us is it tends to be based in what I would call the dream state and tends to be around the AAA. So what do I mean by this? We are quite odd people, I think, is that we really want our kids to live a good life. But we're not sure what that is. So you talk to most people and say they're committed, meaning they spend thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars on a sport. They spend hours and hours on it. They want their kid to live a good life, but there's no real content for what the good life is. So the way most people will talk about this is that if our kids are really involved in all these things, if they accrue all these resources from all this involvement, if they can play another instrument, if they can speak another language, then that gives them the resources so that they can live whatever dream they want in the future. They can get to that school, and that school will help them live whatever dream they want. So we are strange people, us late modern people, because our sense of the good life tends to all be a projection into the future. We want to live our dream. But we never really help our young people understand what's worth dreaming about. What does it mean to live a good life? Whereas Hartmut Rosa describes, he says, us late moderns are weird. If we're like painters who keep setting up our easel, kind of getting paintbrushes organized, getting colors, then hearing there are new paints that are really cool, going and getting those, then resetting the easel, trying to catch the light. We're the kind of people who keep preparing to paint a picture, but never actually paint a picture. I mean, a huge ministry a church can have is helping its whole congregation, particularly young people, be able to articulate what it means to live a good life now. What does it mean to live well? How is God at work in our lives right now, instead of it just being a projection into the future? But when it becomes projected in a dream state, it is just very hard to convince parents that coming to youth group holds just as much value to living your dream as playing in the 8th place hockey game tournament. It feels like those aren't really the same thing. And this is what I mean by the AAA. The AAA is this sense of the good life being all about accessibility, availability, and attainability. And it's very hard to move this up if this kind of intuitive response is really, does soccer hold more accessibility, availability, and attainability to your dream, or reading the book of John with your friends? It's really hard for any of us to feel like, well, going to church holds more accessibility, availability, and attainability than learning Spanish or taking lessons from one of the best piano instructors in the state. It's very hard for us to see that. So if you want to move your youth group up high, you have to somehow convince people there's no more availability, accessibility, and attainability in this. Just one more example of this. This is exactly how college admissions goes. I'm in the midst of it with a senior in high school. We get flyer after flyer after flyer. Every school recruits itself by saying, if you come to our school, we will help you meet your dream, and our school provides accessibility, availability, and attainability. Now think about this. We'll just use examples from my world. We'll use an example from your world and from my world. What does it cost to matriculate at Yale? $80,000 a year, something like that. 86? Yeah, someone has the number there. 86,000. So we'll just use a school in my neck of the woods, Minnesota State Mankato. Good school. It probably costs $25,000 a year. So 86 versus 25,000. Now, could you really say Yale, when it comes to teaching and learning, is more than 2 times better than Minnesota State Mankato? It's better. I mean, it is better. Let's not be naive. It is not better. It is not that much better. But you are not paying for the teaching and learning. When you go to Yale, what you are paying for is accessibility, availability, and attainability. You go to Yale, you have accessibility to an important alumni network. You have the availability of all sorts of programs and facilities, and then you will be able, with a degree from Yale, attain your dream. So that's the point. So it becomes really hard to feel like the accessibility and attainability, the youth group will provide that. Now, I'm making you really, really depressed. But just to take us one step further, confirmation is a really interesting case study on this. Because what's interesting about confirmation is it usually has a beginning and an end point. And I don't know if it's true for you at this congregation, but most churches I know with confirmation, you do sit down with parents and you say, here's the deal. We're going to do a year of confirmation or 2 years of confirmation, whatever we do. And you say you all have to commit. I mean, parents, we have to commit. You have to show up to the confirmation lessons. We're going to have a retreat. You have to need to go on both of those retreats. And everyone says, and then you even use a nice theological word like, we are going to make a covenant together to do this. And people are like, yes, we are in. And then the day before the required retreat, you get a phone call that says, we didn't know she was going to be the lead in the play. We didn't know the tryouts were this day. Sorry. So confirmation is an interesting lesson. And yet, all of us, myself included, would understand that deeply. For instance, well, actually, did you see this on Facebook? There was a story on Facebook of a mother whose son ran the 40-yard dash or something. I can't remember what state it was in, but he had been running all the preliminaries up until the state tournament, and he had become very close to breaking the state record. And the state record had held for like 80 years or something. So it got all this media press that he was now going to run on the university track, and probably just being on that track, he would break this record. And so everyone was so excited to see him run it. And then what got all this publicity is his mother came out and said, he won't run. He won't run at the state meet. She said, his race is late Tuesday night. He will not get home until after midnight. When he finally kind of cools down from the adrenaline of the state meet, he will not get to sleep until 2 or 3 in the morning. And he has confirmation Wednesday night. And I do not want him to be too tired to really engage the confirmation lesson. So my son will not run. Did you read that story? Of course you did, because it's never happened. And it would never happen. And you're sitting there thinking, My kid would run. We would break the record is what we would do. So you see, it's very hard. I mean, we're in this list here. I'm in it too. I mean, it's really, really hard to move it up. The main thing I want you to see is this is why not having a big youth group like 20 years ago happens. It's not just that this church hasn't paid attention. It's not that you haven't had the right youth worker. It's a whole cultural shift that's happened. The days of the big youth group are probably over. But that doesn't necessarily mean that youth ministry is over. So how would we take a shift to respond to this? And there's irony here. Like, for those of us who are doing youth ministry in the 90s, we used to say things like it's youth and family ministry because we really wanted families to be involved, and it was more a desire to have them involved than them actually being involved. The irony here is with this generation, parents are really involved in their kids' lives, really and beautifully, but it's led them to be less involved in church because they have all these other things to do. So I don't think we should compete in the things. I don't think we should try to make youth ministry a thing that is shiny enough that it could move up the list. I don't think it can work, and I think it could lead into certain forms of idolatry in many ways, to use a big theological word. So how should we think about this as we come to our end? Well, I think we should return to identity for a bit. I mean, I told you about identity, that our assumption culturally, and I think it's a wrong one, is that identity is a fully internal construction. That you feel it within you and then you express, this is who I am. But no philosopher would believe that's true. No one formulates their identity by looking within themselves. All philosophers would say identities are always dialogical. It always happens in a conversation. And some philosophers would say to have an identity, actually, you need to be in conversation, and you really ultimately need stories. Your identity is based around stories. If I asked you, who are you? You would be a very boring dialogue partner if you just gave me bullet points of your address, if your ATM number. I mean, that would actually be interesting. I mean, if you just gave me a bunch of information, I would not really know you. Unless I poured it into ChatGPT and then it would tell me a story about who you are. To really know you, I need to hear a story about your life. And this is really interesting because when someone is thrust into an identity crisis, what happens to them is they lose the stories that made their life good. So you've all read that novel or seen that sad independent movie where the person comes home and there's a note on the counter that says, I've never loved you, I've been having an affair for a decade, see you later. And the person is thrust into an identity crisis. The person who reads the note. And they even think, I don't even know who I am anymore. I don't even know what's good anymore. Because they've lost, and they haven't even done the moral violation, it's been done to them, but they feel like they've lost their identity because they've lost the stories they thought made their life good. What formulates our identities is stories. It's not pure activities, but it's a depth of stories. And this takes us back to those basketball parents. I mean, the interesting thing about those basketball parents is they thought basketball was one thing amongst a bunch of other things. That wasn't true. Basketball was not one thing amongst other things. In that family, basketball was a deeply narratival reality. It was a story. When you got under the surface, mom and dad both played basketball through college. Mom and dad met and fell in love at a basketball camp. Mom's dad, the girl's grandfather, coached basketball in a small community for 30 years. The girls were in the stands when a banner with his name on it went up into the rafters. You ask those girls why they love basketball, the oldest would say, I remember when I shot my first three-pointer and I ran back on defense and I looked up in the crowd and there was my grandfather jumping up and down and I thought, I'm going to practice every day. I'm going to shoot 100 three-pointers a day. Or the youngest daughter would say, I remember when my dad took me to get my first shoes for basketball. It was just the two of us and we had ice cream. I mean, it holds this deep value because there's a narrative, a story around it. In some sense, the girls would have a hard time choosing against it because it was such a rich, deep story. Now, we are the kind of people who need to count things. I mean, I just gave you a ranking system with numbers. I get that. But maybe instead of counting the value in the rank level of the thing, maybe what we should really focus on counting is the number of stories of the people here. Maybe what youth ministry is really about is how do we, instead of counting their participation hours, how do we help them really wrestle with stories? The stories of this congregation. The stories of faith and life and doubt and hope. It's hearing those stories, not just the fact that there's a great program in the basement, that will transform their lives anyhow. Will help them have an identity where they see their identity as in Jesus Christ, in the life of a community that confesses Jesus Christ. What actually does the work of transformation is not a great program. It's actually the stories that form us. So maybe we should count the stories. Now, it may very well be true that we do not have it. We don't have the resources. We just don't have it at this moment to be able to compete, to move the youth group up the ranking system. But the reality of it is, that's not what transforms anyhow. What transforms is the moments we give these young people to hear a deep story. So numbers matter. Mark DeVries was a Presbyterian guy who's done stuff in youth ministry. He has this great joke. It's his. I'm giving him credit for it. Where he says, if I go to amusement park with my children, my 3 children, and if I come back to the car and only have 2 of them, and my wife says, where's our 3rd kid? A very bad response is, I'm not into numbers. Come on. And that's a very bad response. So numbers do tell us something, and numbers can be weaved into a narrative. And so if we need to count something, is my point, is maybe we should count the number of stories our young people hear, more than just even their participation hours. Maybe we should say, by the time a young person starts to move on after high school, go to college, or go into VOTEC school, or go into the military, we want them to hear 20, 30, 40 stories of people who have wrestled with God, of people who have had prayer impact their life in a significant way. And the fascinating thing about that is every congregation I know has that available. You have that. Those stories are here. In some sense, you have what young people need the most, is these testimonies of the presence and the absence of God in your life, this yearning for faith. It is interesting because we are at 1 o'clock, we're getting close to 1 o'clock here, and some of you are thinking, football starts very, very soon. So Scott, shut this man up because we have football. Or some of you are just checking your fantasy football lineup right before it's going to start. And it can feel, I've talked to a lot of pastors, it can feel like we live under the tyranny of the NFL. You know, it's the same day. And you think, man, the church is so weak compared to the NFL. I mean, the NFL is a tens of billions of dollar business, and people are in church listening to the sermon, thinking about what wide receiver should I start. You know what I mean? And if you ever go to church in Wisconsin, I'm a Vikings fan, so I like to throw shade on Packers people. But honestly, you go to church in Wisconsin, everyone's in Packers jerseys. And I have seen it. If the pastor gets too close to the noon kickoff game in Central Time, people literally go like this. Because they have to be home on their recliner to get the Cheese Whiz melted just right before the kickoff. This is Packer fans. But the interesting thing about this is that we can feel under the tyranny of the NFL, but it was just 2-3 seasons ago, the NFL celebrated its 100th year. 100 years. And there are TV shows, 100 greatest quarterbacks in NFL history, 100 greatest comebacks, this, that, 100 years. I mean, I know we live under their tyranny, but 100 years? It's cute. It's so cute. 100 years of stories they have. That's nice. In the church, what we have is 2,000 years. Actually, 6,000 years if we go back into our Jewish history. 6,000 years of stories. Across the globe, not just in North America, of people living and dying in the confession of Jesus Christ, of this God who moves out of the desert. And we have incredible stories. They're here. If we can share these stories with our young people, that's what's going to change them. The testimonies are what really does the work of transformation. But to conclude, we have to be very careful when we even use this old word testimony. Because some of us, when we hear testimony, we think the perfect 3-arc kind of story. You know how testimonies go, the stereotype of testimony. I was doing okay. I was teaching chemistry in a local high school, and then I got diagnosed with cancer. Did not know how I was going to pay my medical bills. But lucky for me, one of the kids in my chemistry class taught me how to cook crystal meth. So I started cooking it. I became one of the biggest, baddest drug dealers in all of Albuquerque, New Mexico. Okay, I'm just recapping the plot of Breaking Bad for you, right? So I broke bad. They called me Heisenberg. But then someone told me about Jesus. And since then, everything's been great. I mean, that's one kind of testimony. And often when people in a community hear that, they think, well, I don't have a testimony because I was never a drug dealer. So I don't have that story. Now, don't hear me rightly. If that's our story, if that story is in our community, that's a gift. If it has the 3 acts from things were okay, I broke bad, things got good because God acted for me, we should praise God for that. But we also need to hold up the fact that sometimes you're just right in the middle of it. Sometimes you are wrestling in the dark night of the soul. And young people need to hear those stories too. And those really form. So for instance, you could have someone in your congregation invited to share with your 9th or 10th graders their story, and they come up and they say something like, I know you all are reading the text in Romans that says God works all things out for the good of those who love God. I have to tell you, 9th graders, I used to believe that. I want to believe that. And most of you don't know that I have a daughter, 6 years old, and she's been sick. And we haven't known what's wrong with her. We've been from one specialist to the next specialist. Well, Dr. Phil finally figured it out. And she's got a genetic condition, but there's nothing they can do now until she gets older. The only thing they can do is she has an injection twice a day. And it has to be spaced out perfectly. This story might go. Has to be spaced out. Now every night at 4:30 my alarm goes off. And I walk into my daughter's room that's covered in a pink hue from her nightlight. I have to find her buried amongst her stuffed animals. And I have to shake her awake enough that I can find a vein and I stick her. And every night she cries and she looks at me with her eyes of betrayal. And I have to rub her back and get her back to sleep. But I have to tell you, 9th graders, I haven't fallen asleep since 4:30. Because I go back to my room and I lay and I stare at the ceiling, and most nights I think, okay, God, what's good about this? She's 6 years old. That's me. That's me, 9th graders. I can't even pray anymore. But I still come. That's where I'm at. If that was a story in your community, which I'm sure there's a story like that in your community, sharing that with young people is a testimony, an invitation of what does this mean? Who is Jesus Christ for us in the midst of this? What does it mean to follow God in the midst of the dark night of our soul? Can God meet us in that? But we need those stories too. So my wager is that if we can give kids these stories, that's what will have some faith, because that's what does the identity work. All right, it is getting near kickoff soon, so I will stop and hand it over to Scott. Thank you.
Amazing. So now you know why I wanted you to hear this lecture. Thank you. That's powerful. Do we have any questions? Andy's actually got to get on the road to Princeton. He's wanted down there for some more lectures. He's got some interviews going tomorrow. But we do have a little bit more time. So are there any questions that you'd like to ask before we close? Stefan.
Andy, how do you set the stage for creating and attracting youth to tell those stories?
Yeah.
We all have stories.
Yeah.
The stories aren't the problem.
Yeah.
It is how do we attract and get the assembly
Yeah.
to say those stories?
Yeah, this remains the sticky wicket, if you will. I'm contrasting for you, and I've done this yesterday too, participation with something else. And that is not to say participation doesn't matter at some level. I mean, we have to gather in some way to be able to hear these stories. So that remains an issue. But what I'm worried about is when the greatest measure of what is good ministry is just participation, then you're putting the cart before the horse. So one way to think about this is that when we do have the privilege of being with young people this way, or even with, say, our own grandchildren, our own children, I think there needs to be an emphasis on asking maybe our kids to narrate, or even parents, to narrate why what they do is good. Why is what? And in some ways, it's not. I think what happens when it's just about participation is we think, oh, how could we win parents' attention, time, maybe even money more than basketball? How could it be on par? Instead of saying, no, as the church, we actually really want to honor the places where the Spirit of God is moving and you are pulled into a fullness of meaning. And if that happens on the basketball court, we want to support that. We want to pray for that. But we want you to narrate why it's good. And I think those of us who spend a lot of time in youth ministry have often had an experience where you ask a young person, like, hey, you're really into football. Why do you like football so much? And you ask them to tell the story. Now all of a sudden you're on prophetic ground because they try to narrate why they like it. And they're like, I don't know. Just always done it. I can't. I don't like football. I actually hate football. I'm not going to play football anymore. Like, there is something incredibly humanizing to say, narrate for me what this means. Now, there's some kids are better at telling their story than others and things like that, but there is a certain sense of just curiosity for their humanity to say, wow, this means a lot to you. Why does it mean a lot? And the church's job isn't to try to extract all the hours and attention away from those other things, but to say our full lives are in the glory of God. So tell me how playing the violin brings glory to God. And then we can, it's not about us hoarding your time, but us helping you see how God is moving with it. So that's one way. The other way is, I wouldn't be too concerned about young people telling the stories. I do think we can do a disservice to young people when we take a 14-year-old and like, tell us your story. I don't know. You have to be formed into that. And you learn how to tell a story actually when you hear a lot of stories. So you first have to hear a lot of stories. And I do think it's the adult's responsibility in the congregation to narrate the depth of the Christian story, but also what that Christian story means to them, to young people. And that could be done in a lot of creative ways. Like I know of a church, particularly around COVID, who started to do a little podcast series with folks, it wasn't the pastoral staff, it was other folks who would tell a 12-minute story about a time where God brought life to an experience of loss and brokenness. And then those got posted and families listened to those. And so there's just those become more creative ways to pull folks in to those stories. But I think with young people themselves, the first emphasis is for them to hear stories. And you will always get the kind of stories you'll get the kind of stories back that you tell. And that becomes a whole community faith formation perspective. Is how do you tell your own story inside the story of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ? What does that look like? For instance, how does Paul tell the story? Paul always tells the story of, I was lost and then I was found. I was on the road to Damascus. I was going to wipe out this sect called the Christians, and Jesus Christ came and spoke to me. And out of that death experience came new life. And so there's a way we tell these stories. So if our stories are all about how great we are or how powerful this church is, then those are the stories we'll get back. So there is a kind of formative process of how do we think about the way we'll tell our stories. And that is a major leadership question. And a major leadership question for the pastoral staff here too is how do they teach you to tell your stories in a way that allows for your own freedom in some sense, but also tells it inside this narrative shape of this God who takes all that is dead and brings life out of it. That this is where God moves. And I'm really drawing from Luther here, because Martin Luther really believed that the first place you must always look to find where God is, that the theologian who is in best touch with God, he thought, was the psalmist. So when our stories sound like the Psalms, then it could be God moving. When the stories sound like some triumphant narrative of conquest, those are not the Psalms. So Luther only trusted someone who would do theology or preach always in the cadence of the Psalms. Grief, joy, surprise joy. Just the human pathos of living. And I guess that's my point, is you all have these stories and you knit together a psalter. There's psalms here. And your young people need to read the psalms themselves, but they need to read those psalms next to the psalms of your own life. Some of you have prayed for spouses dying of cancer. Prayed every day for them. Young people need to hear that story. How certain scriptures, how the Sermon on the Mount gave you the vision to keep stepping forward and walking into that treatment center and taking another round of chemo as you continue to repeat this text or that text, or someone from church held your hand. Those are the kind of stories that knit us together and form faith. But sometimes you just gotta wait for it. I mean, the adults, maybe there is. During Lent, we want young people to hear these, or we do know young people come at this time, or but the participation issue still is a challenge. But I want us not to compete for those hours. I think that's a zero-sum game. That ends up being oppositional to what we're after. But what we're really after is the invitation to live this way, to own this story.
Maybe what we need to do is practice telling our stories.
Absolutely.
So we're ready.
Absolutely. Yeah. In some sense, maybe that's what confirmation is it's just built around people in this church who tell them their stories. Yeah.
And you just mentioned asking the kids why they do the things they do, right? And that's sort of what I've been thinking the whole time I've been listening to you, which is behind the things, I think as a parent, there has to be a purpose.
Yeah.
Right? And I'm not too far removed from this whole treadmill of running around with kids to activities. And if you measured the time my kids spent playing soccer, playing tennis, and all those other things, compare that to the time they spent in church, well, obviously they spend more time doing those other activities. But if you ask my kids what's more important, they would definitely tell you that church was more important.
Mm-hmm.
So I think if maybe if we can ascribe a purpose to these things that are being done, so that at least parents recognize that at the close to the top of the list is giving your children the faith foundation that will guide them through their lives. That's a little bit more important than So
well said. And one of the other things, just to remind us here as we come to a close, and I'll think about our football games, is that Christian faith is always passed on with human bodies living together, persons living together. So it very rarely is ever some kind of fully intellectual consent. The reason the Christian faith matters to you is because someone you know lived it out before you. And so why do they know it matters more than all those hours? Because it mattered to their dad. And this is what I think, even with grandparents, the best thing you can give to your grandkids is tell them why this matters to you. Like what's behind it mattering to you that this is important. So the last thing I'll say, as Scott's going to take the big hook and pull me on, is we started yesterday with Charles Taylor, and we'll end. And Taylor has this really interesting piece, he says, in the middle of the secular age, where he says, if you grew up in a kind of, so he's talking about like the scientific argument, the scientism argument that says anyone who needs to believe in an invisible divine force, really what you are is an immature person. You just cannot face the facts that you live and you die. You need some kind of divine force to deal with your psychological inability to confront what is real, which has been a kind of assertion of the new atheists and others, right? And Taylor's point is that will actually be quite a convincing argument to you if the kind of church you grew up in never really dwelt with deep questions. If every deep question you had, they're like, it's Jesus. Don't talk about that. Just forget it. So that will make so much sense to you. Like, oh my gosh, that's true. Every time I had a deep question, they just distracted me with some religious language. He says that argument will never make any sense to you. You will not buy it if you grew up in a kind of congregation where you did watch your grandmother pray for your grandfather as he was battling cancer. You may think, I don't know if I believe it. I don't know if it's true. I don't know if I really care about it. But surely I can't say religious people are just weak-minded people. I mean, it was my grandmother's prayers that drove her into caring for all of these people in her life. Took her into confronting forms of injustice. It was my grandmother's faith that led her to face her illness so bravely. So all I know is that there's something to it. And he said that's the kind of stance we want. Our lives we live before our young people is the invitation to search and to see what God is doing. And that's the greatest gift we can give them, I think. It's the invitation to search and to journey with us. So I will stop there.
Thank you so much, Andy. You've given us a lot to think about, pray about, to reflect on how long, oh Lord. I just want to remind you all that our next adult forum is on October 6th. That's Sunday, October 6th. Lauren Patterson, the CEO of the New Canaan Foundation, Community Foundation, is going to be here speaking about the foundation, but also about a health and well-being survey that they're helping to sponsor, and they want to talk about that with us. So just plan on that, please. Again, let's say thanks to those people who brought the food, and I just want to pray for Andy before he has to go off to his next lecture series here. Loving God, thank you for this time together. Thank you for the reminder that you, even in our secular age, even in our small town, our small church, that you are alive and at work. Help us to wait on you, Lord, and to look, to seek, to ask, to search for where you are at work in our own lives, in the life of our community, in the life of our town, to participate in your work. Help us to tell our story. Help us to figure out what these clinkers for Christ are all about here at New Canaan First Presbyterian Church. We trust your Spirit to continue to lead us. Send us forth now in your peace, and safe travels for those who are traveling, and to bring us back together with more stories of your faithfulness. In Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. Go and serve the Lord.